What Orthodoxy actually gives you is everything you're looking for as a Catholic. My name is Brian Donohue. I'm an Orthodox Christian. I live just outside Washington, D.C. in rural Virginia. Married to my beautiful wife, Hannah. We have 4 amazing kids. Go to St. Patrick Orthodox Church in Bealton, Virginia. Some people have heard of it because it's a fairly well-known church that serves the Western Rite in the Orthodox Church, as well as our priest, Father Patrick Cardine. I was born and raised Roman Catholic. Grew up in a devout Catholic family. We took our faith very seriously. We were at Mass every week, often daily Masses, prayed the Rosary, learned about our faith. And I'd say the kind of Catholic we were, I'd describe as like a JP2 style Catholic. So conservative, you could say, theologically, interested in being faithful to what the Church teaches. Had no interest in more sort of a more liberal or progressive style of Catholicism, but also not, traditionalist, not trad. 20, 30 years ago, that wasn't probably as mainstream as it is today.
When do you think that it started rising up more traditional forms of Catholicism?
I think a couple factors. One, I think was, 2 main things, I guess. One is I think Pope Benedict XVI initiated a bit of a shift when he was more favorable toward the traditional Roman liturgy, the Latin Mass, the TLM, the extraordinary form, whatever you want to call it. When he signaled, more support for that traditional Mass, I think that helped give it some attention in more mainstream, Catholic circles than it had before. And then the other thing is just the internet. The internet has this way of decentralizing information where anyone can get on YouTube or whatever and share their thoughts, share their perspective, and share images, share video. And so for a lot of people it was they didn't need a Latin Mass to be down the street from them. They didn't need one in their diocese even. They could go online and see this more traditional liturgy. They could hear the chant, they could learn about it and learn the history of it, read books, things like that. And I think that contributed a ton to the rise of now, I guess, more traditionalist forms. I mean, that's what everybody wants, basically, right? That's what most Catholics, at least in the U.S., I think, are attracted to.
Many people might have a crisis of faith in high school, or they might wrestle with even, is God real? Is Christianity true? Did you go through that phase? Some people do, some people don't.
Honestly, not really. I didn't have a dramatic conversion story. There wasn't a particular moment where I was out stealing cars and doing drugs or whatever, and then God turned my life around. It was always more of, I guess, there were moments where I would say I certainly struggled hard with aspects of my faith, or whether it's intellectually trying to work through things, or just in your day-to-day life trying to live out the faith, and wondering, like, is this even possible? Can I even do this, right? But it was always more of that daily struggle. I never drifted far from active life as a Catholic. Yeah.
So then you went to go study philosophy?
Well, so I would say it's interesting. Early high school, I was very into more of you could say the youth group scene, youth conferences at Steubenville kind of thing, played in a praise band, played guitar in a praise band. But then as I was going through high school, I started to read philosophy and theology for the first time. I remember picking up some works by Plato, and I'm like a junior in high school and just blowing my mind. And I'm like, as first exposed to thinking about topics like this, right? And theology as well, as Pope Benedict XVI had just become Pope at the time. I was a Catholic who, loved the Pope, wanted to follow the Pope, and so I started picking up some books of Ratzinger and tried my best to read through his his books. I didn't know. I probably got about 20% of it, but I picked up books like The Spirit of the Liturgy or his series on the life of Jesus, and absolutely loved it, wanted to dive further, wanted to dive deeper. And so when I went to college at Franciscan University of Steubenville, pretty well known in Catholic circles, I was studying philosophy and theology. So very interested in diving into those, into both of those topics. There were really a couple different things that were happening in that time in college. One of them was, as I mentioned, Pope Benedict had loosened restrictions on the traditional Latin Mass, on the extraordinary form, and that was a major eye-opening moment for me, because really the way that I grew up and the Catholicism that I knew was pretty clearly, a post-Vatican II style of Catholicism. The Mass itself was, was a Novus Ordo, done in a pretty, mainstream way. And so what that opened up for me was just the idea that there was a much richer tradition out there. There was a deeper well to, explore that I really didn't have a good sense of, starting with the liturgy itself, right? For example, when I was reading Pope Benedict, it turned me on to a book by Monsignor Klaus Gamber, The Reform of the Roman Liturgy. I don't know if you're familiar with that one, but Joseph Ratzinger at the time had written a preface or an introduction to that book, and the basic premise of that book was that the liturgical reform of Vatican II had gone off course. And this was a book that was still in favor of some liturgical reform, but it really zeroed in on this issue of ad orientem worship, of praying the liturgy facing the east. And it really, eviscerated any kind of argument in favor of changing that practice and flipping, the priest around to face the people. And he showed, sort of theologically why that didn't make sense. Historically, it was based on, some bad liturgical archaeology about the early church, where they said, oh, they have these freestanding altars, the priest must have gone around, to the other side. Anyway, all of that was very eye-opening to me, to the point where the deeper I went in, got into that, it was really hard to accept sort of the Novus Ordo status quo, you could say, right? And I was attracted to more traditional forms of liturgy. I was part of a group of students that at Franciscan that brought the Latin Mass to the campus to be said weekly. Actually,
there's a lot going to ask you if you had experienced it while you were at Franciscan University, but you were one of the ones that brought it there.
Yeah, by the time I got there, I was like all on fire for Latin Mass, basically. And was part. I was like arguing with my friends, about why the old Mass was better and the new Mass was bad, or at least not as good, and pushed for this. And there was definitely there was resistance that really wasn't Steubenville style, you could say. But we ended up getting permission to do this, a weekly Latin Mass, and so I spent some time in those circles, definitely going deep into more of a trad style of Catholicism. I ultimately backed away from that world, though, not because I, necessarily changed how I felt about, the beauty of the traditional liturgy, the richness that was there, or, the sense that so much had been lost throughout the Reform, but really just because, I guess, culturally, traditionalism, it has a reputation, or maybe a stereotype, but it has that for a reason. I would describe it as spiritually toxic, actually. And I don't mean any offense to anyone who's part of that world, but hopefully you have a sense of what I mean. I mean that I think there's a lot of anger in those communities. There's a sense, and some of it, based on the fact that they're in a difficult situation, especially in the last couple of years. They do have the sense that the church has lost all of this goodness and this richness and this beauty. But I think that the way that's manifested itself in a lot of traditionalist communities is, yeah, like a kind of harshness, a kind of anger that, is not just my experience. I mean, I think a lot of people have experienced
Were you beginning
that.
to feel angry a lot?
Exactly,
time?
yeah, exactly, right. So what I realized about myself is I was getting angry. I was turning into a real jerk to everyone I knew. I was right about everything, and I was so mad about it, right? I had a lot of, anger and bitterness, and I was, to the point where I couldn't go to a Novus Ordo Mass without feeling this, indignant, anger and being so bothered by it. And it felt like, I'd built my house next to a toxic waste dump or something, and I was just getting poisoned and sickened by just being exposed to that. And, none of that had anything to do with the liturgy itself, which was beautiful. It was just entirely the sort of the context or the way that functioned as like a culture almost. So,
did you at that time have any exposure to other liturgies like the Byzantine or Syriac or any of the other ancient forms?
Yeah, so I think I was a sophomore or junior there when
the Wise Phone 2, which I currently use as my phone. It's an amazing phone that helps you not doom scroll or be addicted to social media and other vices because it doesn't have a web browser, but it does function like a phone. You can call, you can text, you can take pictures, you can do videos. It even has apps like Uber and Lyft. You can order food, maps to get around town, all the things that you kind of need in this modern life. While at the same time being able to have a boundary between you and work or you and distractions. So you can be more present with your family, with your kids, with your spouse, whomever. This has been a very freeing experience for me to have the Wise Phone 2. Again, you can get $40 off through my discount code KING today.
There's a Byzantine Rite Catholic seminary in Pittsburgh, not far from Steubenville, and they came to the campus and they served a divine liturgy. My first time, I was barely aware, probably not aware at all, that Eastern Christians existed, and I remember I saw a flyer for it or something, and I went, and I was completely bowled over. I had never, seen or experienced anything like that, And it's funny looking back. I'm sure, it was like 4 or 5 seminarians and a congregation of people who didn't know the music all, trying to sing it, and I'm sure we sounded like a bunch of, dying cats or something. But to me, it was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. And some of it was, the richness of the prayers. I think in the Eastern tradition cut through a lot of things for me. I think it kind of cut to the heart for me to see something that was, thoroughly traditional, but it had that that kind of richness isn't even really the right word. There was something so profound, so tender, so transcendent about what we were praying and what we were doing, and I just felt completely transported. I was if you've ever been to Steubenville, their chapel is from the era where they decided to make churches ugly, basically. No offense, but it's a very modern looking building. I was in heaven in that building. I felt like the sky could have ripped open and the angels would have just swarmed in. Like it was that, like the layer between heaven and earth was so thin. It felt like so that was that was another key moment for me, just to become aware of this Eastern tradition. It was around the same time that I was reading the Fathers of the Church for the very first time. I was in a class. And this, like, these things went together so well, because I remember, we started with the earliest apostolic fathers, and reading the martyrdom of Polycarp, reading the epistles of St. Ignatius, and again, completely bowled over. All the theology I knew was like, it was like basically out of the Baltimore Catechism, and secondhand, sort of much more scholastic or Tridentine era type theology. I had been reading folks like Pope Benedict, but even then I didn't understand most of what I was reading him anyway. So, but reading these fathers of the church, there was something so overwhelming about that, and it felt like they just breathed this different atmosphere. There was definitely a journey in terms of discovering these traditional and ancient liturgies, but it started to also go hand in hand with, well, there's a little more to the theological picture here as well.
The church fathers can be a big game changer for, I mean, of course I encountered them as a Protestant, but even as a Catholic, it can be both inspiring but also challenging.
Yeah. And, I think in the case of, Protestants who are learning more about church history, that's very clear, obvious. Like there's lots of stories like that. For Catholics, I think it can be a bit subtler, and maybe it's changing now a little bit. I think maybe there's some more interest in the fathers than there was 20 or 30 years ago. I don't know. Again, the internet gives you access to a lot of things. To that point, the fathers didn't play any, I didn't have any sense of attachment to them whatsoever, The saints that I venerated and that I felt closest to, they were all born after 1500, or 1700. They were very recent saints. I didn't have a sense of immediate connection to the early church. The whole first millennium kind of felt like a big black hole, honestly. I mean, everything about, I would say the driving force in the theology was all from a later date. So reading them, and many others, St. Gregory of Nyssa and St. Augustine, and lots of others, it really just opened my eyes to a whole different world. Like the way that they thought about theology just felt so different. The way that they approached things it was hard to put into words, but it felt like I may as well have visited another country or maybe another planet. Like they were just on a different level, and that was a huge moment.
You were getting into the fathers. You experienced your first divine liturgy, and then did you just graduate from Steubenville and fly away, or what led to eventually becoming Orthodox? Was that soon after, or was there a time period that?
Definitely took some time. Looking back, I can see how all of these steps were leading me on that path. I even remember, this is a funny story, I remember I was a senior and I had to find a theology thesis topic, and I just had this idea bouncing around in my head that the West could really learn something from the Eastern liturgy. Like our liturgy has kind of been on rough times recently. We should learn from them and what they're doing something right over there. We need to go. And so I went to Dr. Scott Hahn in his office hours, and I don't know what I said. It kind of tumbled out of me, just this incoherent, pitch for a thesis or whatever. And he just kind of looked at me politely, but a little bit confused and concerned, and he, asked, who are you reading about this? And I'm on this, topic. And I'm like, nobody. This is not, I didn't read this in a book. I went and experienced this. And I was like, they've got it. I don't know what it is, but they've got it. And what they have, I feel like we need some kind of revitalization thing here. And so he just kind of, furrowed his brow and said, well, how about you go, read some books on this and come back to me when you have a clear thesis statement. And I never did. I ended up, going a different direction. But as late as that, I was really wrestling with this question. And maybe a way to put it is, what does it mean to be faithful to the tradition? Which is what I wanted. I wasn't interested in any kind of liberal, progressive, whatever. I wanted to believe what the church always believed. I wanted to believe all the way back to the apostles. That's what I was in pursuit of. Where things got tricky was, so as I complete my 4 years, my theology education, and I feel like I'm not really any closer to answering that question. And again, Pope Benedict played such a huge role in this. It's his fault that I couldn't answer this question. I like to joke actually that Pope Benedict XVI is the reason I became Orthodox. It's kind of my cheeky, call it your clickbait reason for why I became Orthodox. But because in addition to this, highlighting this problem of the liturgy, the other main thing, this was his main theological project, was what do you do about the church? What do you do about theology before and after Vatican II? How do you reconcile those things, Before reading him, I wasn't even really aware, or studying theology, in college, I wasn't even really aware that this was a problem. I didn't know there was a problem to be solved, and now there was this tension that I couldn't resolve, that I didn't know how to resolve, which is the way the church functioned and its doctrine and theology looks pretty different before Vatican II and after Vatican II. And maybe there's a way to resolve that, but it's not obvious. It seems like a big change if you just look at it, on the surface. I was at a point where I was considering my options, like how do I do this, right? So, you could take the approach that the old is bad and the new is good, right? I guess that's the liberal or progressivist approach, right? There was the Dark Ages before, and now we're liberating ourselves with this new Vatican II church. And that was a non-starter for me. I was like, nope, that's not it. Could take the approach that, the old is good and the new is bad, right? And that's more the traditionalist perspective, right? Is things were great. Everything was great, and the church was, everything before the year, 1962 or 1955 or whatever was all, seamless and wonderful. And then things started to go off the rails with Vatican II. But again, I that one didn't work for me either. One major reason was, at the end of the day, it would be self-defeating because Rome had moved on. The Vatican had moved on. Cat's out of the bag, toothpaste is out of the tube. Rome is not going to suddenly say, you know what, actually we should have Christian kings and religious liberty is, totally false, and it's this pernicious heresy like, Pius IX thought. And by the way, if you don't submit to the Roman pontiff, you're going to hell automatically. Like that's not going to happen. Like that pivot back into the pre-conciliar world is like, it's a non-starter. It's not going to happen. And the traditionalists, while they were, holding on to something in the liturgy that was, I couldn't deny it was good and beautiful. Like, where do you go with that? They had to try to keep something going when, again, the 99% of the church had moved on. And I didn't see any way out of that, right? And even then, there were other problems. There were bigger problems there, which was everything so great and awesome and seamless before Vatican II? Some of those things I just mentioned, those are pretty striking doctrines. I was like, could I really get on board with any of this either, right? Or, just that general approach to theology. And again, culturally, it seems like it's maybe very Catholic, but not very Christian all the time. And then finally, the other thing is just, reading the church fathers, it seems like they don't have they're not very much like these traditionalists either. So there's now another disconnect of, you're saying this is the tradition, but it feels like there's this whole other era of the church when these things don't match up as obviously, right? Mm-hmm. As you might think.
Did it feel like a different forest or a different kind of ecosystem almost?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it, a different ecosystem. I mean, I don't know, the questions they asked, the way that they tried to answer those questions, the things they thought were important, the things they took to be authorities and the things they took to matter, the way they approached theological issues. I mean, it again seemed like it was not obvious, let me put it that way. It's not obvious that they went hand in hand. And in fact, when I tried to talk to more traditionalist Catholics about the fathers, it was really interesting the response I got, which was, well, the fathers are okay, but they basically saw them as a more primitive form of Christianity or a more primitive form of theology. That, they weren't very systematic, they didn't apply their reason or rational powers rigorously enough or something. So there was still a lot of ambiguity. There was a lot of poetic language. I even heard them critiquing Augustine pretty harshly for being, a Platonist rather than an Aristotelian. Like I ran into that a lot. He's not scientific enough. He's not logical enough. There's too much wishy-washiness, right? And that they associated with, that's like the liberal theology is like wishy-washy. Everything is like crunched like by a calculator and put on a spreadsheet and it's all perfect, right? So for them, the church fathers were like early attempts by Christians, groping around in the dark, trying to figure out these theological issues. And then it basically took Aquinas to come in and shed his light everywhere and clarify everything. And that's when theology became a science. That's when it was real, it was serious, He took everything good from them, he systematized it, he summed it up. So you didn't really need them anymore. They were like any more than, Newton needed alchemy, or I guess he did alchemy any more than Newton needed Aristotle's physics or something, right? It was just he surpassed them. And it was interesting because then I realized that, wait a minute, they also have this progressivist understanding of history, that like history's on this upward trajectory. They just cut it off in, 1270 or whatever, rather than in, the modern era. But they have the same understanding of history, that there was like this confused, ambiguous theology, and it just got clearer over time. So all of that really turned me off. Like theologically, this traditionalist approach just, again, didn't work for me.
Did this lead to a small crisis or a big crisis, or what was going inside of you to resolve tying these clouds together?
Intellectually, I just kept trying to grapple with it, read more, think about it, talk, debate, discuss, etc. On the practical level, I would just like, got to go to church every Sunday, get to a divine liturgy when you could, but those aren't always available. So just kind of, go to your local, just normal, regular Catholic parish, which, probably wasn't a bad thing for me at the time either, given how, so much felt like it was shifting. But, it still felt like it felt like it wasn't a place I could land as home, like I couldn't, or maybe I could find a way to accept it, but I didn't know how. And the more I grappled with it, I thought about, what are my other options here, right? Both of those don't seem like they're working. Another one that occurred to me is, I've heard people talk about, well, there really is no difference, old and new, like before Vatican II and after Vatican II. Actually, nothing's changed, that it's all completely, seamless. And I guess it's, you shouldn't believe anyone who tells you that anything changed, whether they're liberal or traditionalist. And again, start poking at it a little bit, and it doesn't really hold up. It doesn't make sense. I'll just give one example. You have in 1524 or something like that, a pope writing I guess it was a papal bull. It was Exsurge Domine is the name of it, responding to Martin Luther. And one of the things he says in there, throwing all of his authoritative weight behind it, is that it's the will of the Holy Spirit to burn heretics at the stake. And you're like, okay, well, clearly Vatican II doesn't believe that. It explicitly says, not only is there a right to religious liberty, but like any violence toward anyone because of their religious beliefs is absolutely out of the question. If you're not a Catholic, well, you're still just, pretty close to us, kind of separated brethren, like, Catholics and Lutherans, are they really all that different? That's the tenor of that. So, I don't know, don't tell me the church never changed its teaching or doctrine. There's what I was discovering was there were dozens of examples of this where things really had shifted. So can't say just the new is all good, the old is bad. Can't say the old is all good, the new is bad. Can't say there is no difference, it's an illusion. There's only one other option, which was that, yes, there was a change, but the change was good because it helped us get back to the core of what the faith was supposed to be. And this, I think, was what Pope Benedict was trying to do. He was trying to say, yes, some of those earlier statements about, burning heretics at the stake, or, Pius IX's pretty strong rejection of religious liberty, things like that, those were bad. But, those were sort of a husk around this core teaching. The core teaching was really about respect for people's freedom. It was really about, we kind of lost sight of that as a church, but we can recover that, right? And, there's others, I think, who take this approach and are open about this. There's a writer, Larry Chapp, who writes articles for, he's a great, series of articles, I think, expositing this type of approach that Benedict or Ratzinger advocated for.
Did you ever read Pope Benedict's audiences where he goes through all the church fathers?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. As soon as I, discovered the fathers and I found out Pope Benedict had a book on the fathers of his audiences, I ate it up. I was and I found it, because he wasn't a scholastic, he wasn't a trad, he wasn't a Thomistic type of thinker. He had much more affinity with the fathers. He was someone who was trying to get back to a more patristic mode of theology, part of the whole ressourcement or ressourcement, or however you pronounce it, movement, right? To say, hey, there really something needs to be adjusted here, right? Now, I will say, at the end of the day, I struggle to try to make that work because, again, the church comes out and authoritatively teaches things. Turns out later it can, in retrospect, decide, well, that wasn't the real teaching. There's a core underneath it. It started to hit me that that's a dangerous game to play. That once you open that door, everything in the history of the church, you can relitigate it, right? So are there...
How do people respond to that today? They might just say, well, that wasn't an actual dogma.
Yeah. I think people say things like that. They'll say, well, that wasn't the right kind of authoritative teaching. It was a reformable one, or it was not infallible. And here's the problem is you start asking, okay, how do we know which ones are the reformable ones? How do we know which ones are the infallible ones? I remember hearing, about papal infallibility. The Pope has only made an infallible declaration 2 times, right? Presumably the Assumption in 1950 and the Immaculate Conception in 1854. But is that true? I knew other theologians who said, no, he's done it hundreds of times, tons of times, right? And so you realize that while the church has authoritative teachings, it doesn't have an authoritative teachings on the authoritativeness of its teachings, right? That's something theologians have to reconstruct from the history of the church, and they have a perspective, a point of view on what they think the right criteria are for what makes something a certain level of authoritative or reformable or infallible. So, you get 10 theologians in a room, they might give you 10 different answers about the question, how many times has the Pope spoken and taught infallibly? Not quite that simple, right? I know theologians who think that papal bull I mentioned, Exsurge Domine, is an infallible statement because he comes out and he says it in the language is very strong, so it's not crazy to read it that way.
So what you're saying is it could be dogma. We don't know if it would be dogma, but there's at least been a big paradigm shift, a big change of thinking. Right.
Yeah. Again, the way I would put it is you have authoritative teaching A, authoritative teaching B. A and B contradict each other. Other than the fact that we live in the time of teaching B, it's not clear why one would have more authority than the other, and it's not clear that we could have the right criteria to say, well, those ones are the reformable ones. Those are the ones that can change, and these other ones can't, because people are going to disagree about which ones are changeable. Pius IX probably wouldn't have thought that his teaching on religious liberty was a changeable one. He was coming down very hard on it, right? But it struck me at one point that this is exactly the same way that Pope Francis sees the history of the church's doctrine, right? The famous example of the death penalty. Well, yes, those earlier teachings said the death penalty was okay, but actually the core teaching is respect for the dignity of the human person, and the gospel rejects this. So he comes out and says it's morally inadmissible and contrary to the gospel. And he's using the same logic as Pope Benedict, just on a different topic. But it's the exact same approach. Father James Martin feels this way about the history of Catholic teaching. Yes, that was the teaching that was there. He's not saying that was always the teaching. He's not saying, right? He's saying that there's a reform that has to happen because the real core, the real center of the truth about, homosexual people is this thing, right? And so we need to change the church's teaching. So maybe to sum this up, people often say Pope Benedict XVI had a hermeneutic of continuity about this issue, right? At one point I did a word study on this. There's only one time in all of his writings that he uses the phrase hermeneutic of continuity. Every other time, he calls it the hermeneutic of reform in continuity. And that's a big difference. He was a reformer. He believed in reform. He did not believe that things were just seamless, right? But it opens up this, door to, well, we can relitigate most things, right? What in principle couldn't you do, especially if it's the Pope, though, who's the one doing it, right? Who's going to tell him he can't relitigate and say, actually, the real teaching is this, right?
In your journey, you graduate from Franciscan University, and then where do you head after that?
Yeah. So finished there, and then I went off to a doctoral program in Buffalo, New York, University of Buffalo, pursuing a doctorate in philosophy, get married, so starting life there as well. Setting down some roots there. Going through my philosophy program, focusing more on in my academics on philosophical issues and getting exposed to some different, it's not a Catholic school, it's a state school. It's a very different approach to philosophy, and learning all about that is really interesting. But also now, having on the theological side, this not knowing where to go, not knowing where to land. And so it was around this time, just when I had moved to Buffalo, that some friends of mine from Franciscan told me they were becoming Orthodox out of the blue. And in some cases in these cases it was different groups of different friends, even friends who didn't even know each other, independently coming to me and telling me this. And I was, my first reaction was like, well, don't you know better, right? Don't you know that the Orthodox are a bunch of, squabbling, ethnic, enclaves who, are stuck in the past in a bad way. They're this frozen museum church or whatever. And besides, you have to be Greek or Russian to be Orthodox or whatever. And so, I called them up, and I kind of wanted to fight them on this. I wanted to debate them. Like you tell me, you justify to me why you would leave the bark of Peter and things like that. To their credit, they refused to argue with me. They didn't do it. They tried to answer my questions, but they were so non-confrontational about it. They were not trying to convince me of anything. They were not trying to poach me. They were not trying to, give me their knockdown argument for orthodoxy. I challenged them with my questions, and they politely responded. And then I walked away feeling very confused. I had a friend who told me, he had a changing conception of what unity in the church meant or something, and I had no idea what he was talking about. I think it makes sense to me now, but at the time I was like, what are you talking about? Like, give me the, chapter and verse and let's duke this out. But it got to the point where I was so, liturgically homeless, theologically confused, that I think I got to a point where I became open to, okay, let's hear what these Orthodox have to say. Like, there's another side to this story, right? All I've heard is sort of this very superficial, apologetics, polemics against Orthodoxy, but they have, they're serious. These people I knew, these friends of mine, very serious Christians, very smart, brilliant people, they're not just, stupid or evil or whatever. I should take this seriously. And so I was, picking up books left and right. I would just get random ones out of the library. I didn't, ask them for some recommendations. The first one that really hit me for whatever reason was Metropolitan Callisto Swear's The Orthodox Way. I know a lot of people start with The Orthodox Church. I'm ashamed to say I've never actually read it. Never read his book, The Orthodox. It's sitting on my shelf, and I've never read it. I should probably read it now. But I read The Orthodox Way, and something about it cut through everything. Just cut through everything. Like, this is it. Like, his perspective was so refreshing, It just cut through all the noise and said, this is it. This is what orthodoxy is. Again, not in a polemical way, not in a I'm gonna beat you over the head and convince you way, but just showing you what it was, right? As much as you can in a book. And so then, around the same time, coincidentally, providentially, my wife and I, we move into a new apartment. There's a park across the street. We're in a random suburb in Buffalo. Our first daughter was just born. We got to the park to, walk around, play. And there's this guy there, and, young guy, long black robe, long dark beard, ponytail, big golden cross, and he's playing with his kids at the playground. And I'm like, who is this guy? I think this is one of those Orthodox people in the wild, but so, randomly, across the street. And, just, as parents do, nod politely and sort of maybe say hi, at the park. Turns out his church, his little Russian church, could probably fit, 75 people if they all squeezed in, was 2 blocks away, nestled in a random suburb. And I think the first time I actually stopped there, I think they were getting rid of some furniture or something, and we picked it up off the curb, and he offered to, help, lift the furniture or whatever. But it eventually hit me after, all of this searching. Woke up, one morning, and we had spent time, we had been there for over a year. We had been going around trying different parishes, trying to find a home, and go to a certain place for a couple weeks and feeling like, oh, this is real. Like, it was, the norm was a fairly liberal sort of a Catholic environment, You see some weird things, nothing too extreme, they're not clown masses or anything, but just, this is hard to see this as home. So that was kind of discouraging. And so then one morning, I remember I just woke up and, first thought popped in my head is like, I got to go to that Orthodox church. It's right there. I can walk. Like, it's right there. Because I'm staring down the barrel of, let's try, parish number 50 on the list or whatever. And, but there's this Orthodox church right there. So I just got up and told Hannah, I said, I'm going to go over to that Orthodox church. And she just kind of said, okay. And so, yeah, I wandered over there, walked in, very sort of confused, disoriented, looking around, where am I, sort of what's going on, and was greeted very warmly by a woman I now know is the deacon's wife for the parish, and told me, oh, we do a lot of standing. If you need to sit down, like, don't worry about it. Like, we're going to be here for a while. You're not going to be ready for this. And then I just and I just stood there and wept for 2 hours. I felt like that experience I had briefly, that first divine liturgy, where again the border between heaven and earth felt like it was paper thin, cut it with a butter knife. And all of the music, the chant, the prayers, everything washed over me. And there's the young priest, serving the liturgy, gives a powerful homily. Like, I'm used to the little 10-minute nothing homilies in some of these Catholic parishes. They don't really say anything, And here's a guy who comes out, and I feel like I'm like, hearts are burning within you as he's preaching moment. And they get to the end, and they keep chanting they keep referring to God as, the one who loves mankind. And it just hit me in that moment. I'm like, they really believe this. And this is not just like paying lip service to this. Like, I have to say, God is loving or merciful or whatever. There was something very immediate about it, and something very direct about it. It didn't need to be qualified. It didn't need to be, I don't know, did you meet the 3 conditions for mortal sin or something, and then maybe, God won't reject you, sort of thing. This was just very immediate and present. And, and then afterwards they're like, oh, come eat with us. And at that point I was, head spinning. Like, I was like, so kind of overwhelmed. And so, had a wonderful experience there, went home, went about my day, my studies, everything. And, next Sunday rolls around and I've got to ask myself the tough question. I'm like, all right, so do I try to find, do I go back to the Catholic parish and try to do this? Or there it is right there, that church is right there. So. Did
your wife grow up Catholic as well?
Yes. Yeah, very much so. She was also Catholic. And again, a practicing Catholic family, very active Catholic family. And she didn't know what to do with all this. She was very patient, very tolerant. But it did reach a point, I was going back again and again and getting sucked in, reading more, learning more, very excited, everything. At a certain point, she kind of had to step in and say, well, we got to pump the brakes on this. This is like, you're getting serious about this. I'm not on board with this, and she had no reason to be. I mean, this was the right reaction on her part. And, our second child is coming along. She's like, we have to get him baptized. Like, you can't be going off to some other church while we need to be a family. We need to be together on this. So after about a year of visiting that parish, I actually backed off. We were all going together to the Catholic parish. This went on for a few years. And, she puts it like, yeah, and Brian was miserable the whole time, feeling like I had this taste of something, and to have it taken away. And I tried to be a good sport about it. I did feel that sense of loss, like this, everything I had been wrestling with and everything I had been searching for felt like it all clicked into place here. This was that, fidelity to the tradition. This was that otherworldly liturgy, which wasn't embarrassed about that, didn't try to throw it out. This was that living connection to the ancient church. This was real Christian community. This was everything.
Did you sense that things were much more integrated?
Definitely. Integrated is a great way to put it. Calls to mind a quote. There was a Benedictine monk who became Orthodox. I actually don't know how to pronounce his name. Placide de Sales, something like that. I know how to, I don't know. Don't know how to pronounce it. Sorry for the French speakers out there. I think his years were roughly 1920 to 2015, something like that. He was a Benedictine monk. He ended up becoming Orthodox. He wrote something just before Vatican II where he said the thing he struggled with as a Benedictine was our rule, the rule of St. Benedict, and our liturgy are patristic. Our theology is Dominican. Our spirituality is Carmelite. And none of these things feel like they fit together. He was feeling that kind of fragmentation. And
it was no longer originally Benedictine.
Yeah, that it was
overwhelmed by other later streams.
That even just that the liturgy itself, because the ancient Western liturgy it's patristic. It goes all the way back deep into the first millennium, and he experienced that, and that was very meaningful to him. And he loved the Church Fathers, but sort of the official line in theology, especially before Vatican II, was much more optimistic in its framework, and so that was the dominant theological framework. So he felt like there was this mismatch, and he talks about there were lots of things he loved and appreciated about Aquinas, a lot that he really, admired him for, but he couldn't help but feel there was this, disconnect. And by contrast to, to the point of your question there, everything was so seamless and integrated in the Orthodox Church. There was no question, there was no crisis of identity. They knew exactly who they were. And then once you experience that, and it's a cliche, but it's so true. Like, you have to experience it firsthand. You can read about Orthodoxy in a book, you can read about the theological debates in a book, but really at the end of the day, it has to be real and experiential. It can't just be in the world of concepts and words and books and things. It has to be flesh and blood and spirit and real. It has to be incarnated in actual life. It has to be existential, not just, academic. And, once I experienced that, it was so clear to me. I mean, I think maybe one way to put it is like, I did have all sorts of questions intellectually, like how could I square this, right? How do I square this with what I understand about the papacy and things like that? That was the biggest one for me. But at a more immediate level, kind of at the level of, the heart, you could say, it was just obvious. It was clear. I mean, you take a step back and you ask your question, like, who changed, right? You don't need to be a brilliant theologian or historian. Honestly, I don't think so. To look at these two and say, who changed?
Father Gabriel Bunch, who was a Benedictine monk who became Orthodox in 2013, he said something similar where, of course, if you go back to the schism, you can find certain problems on both sides, but overall, if you really look to see who really changed their paradigm and who truly left to, he felt it was
right.
papacy.
It really, and that was the impression I walked away, the more I learned is, the Orthodox were always just doing what they were doing. At no point did they say, and we're going to start doing this now. We're going to go off, take a left turn. There were some clearer moments where maybe it wasn't a sharp left turn, but in some cases a drift that seemed to be clear on the Roman side of things. It's ironic, Roman Catholic apologists will sometimes say things like, on the one hand, they'll say, the Orthodox have compromised on certain teachings and things. And they'll turn around and say, well, they can't get together and decide on anything and actually change it. I'm like, so when exactly did this happen? They can't hold councils and decide on things, but they all got together and unanimously decided to change things, It didn't fit, it didn't sit right. But I definitely integrated.
So you're back at the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
And you're there for a bit to stay together, keep your family together. And then what happens after that? Yeah, so the couple years of that, and then at one point, I won't speak for my wife, but she has her own journey and her own things she wrestled with and thought about and prayed about. But it was pretty spontaneous. I mean, one day she just approaches me and says, I'm open to visiting an Orthodox church. And so, grace of God, we decide, let's explore this. So we had moved at that point to a different part of the city. There was another Orthodox church that was closer. We started visiting that. Again, lovely, wonderful parish, an OCA parish. A lot of love for the priests there and the community, and they welcomed us so warmly. It could be such a strange experience, because I think my general experience in Catholicism was that parish life, you're kind of anonymous. Like, maybe you can get plugged in, do things, get to know people. Maybe you have friends who go to the parish, but
you could very easily walk in, like, and it's like walking into any Target in America. Like, there's no real difference. Like, you just go into a Catholic parish and like, you're not part of a particular parish necessarily, you could be very anonymous. This was, this is a real concrete community of people who are family, and they're going to treat you like family when you walk in the door. And that itself was very powerful. So yeah, we were there for about a year. We ended up becoming catechumens after several months. And that parish was interesting too. When we arrived, they had just recently started experiencing a recurring miracle at the parish. There was a myrrh streaming icon on the royal doors. And there's a video of this online. We'd stand there in the liturgy and the myrrh was just pouring off of this thing for 2 hours. It was wild. And the priest would go and just collect it and anoint everyone with it. And for them, this was like normal. This was like normal life. And so we were blessed to experience that too. But yeah, we became catechumens. We started catechism with the priests there. And then there was an opportunity to move. So my wife grew up down here in Northern Virginia, and we wanted to move. I'd finished grad school. We planned on moving down anyway at some point. A job opportunity popped up. So we hit pause on that and said, well, we're not chrismated yet or anything, but we're just going to have to figure this out down there. And so it all happened very quickly, and we moved down here end of 2018, and had to find an Orthodox parish to call home. So there was a handful in our area. In the broader DC area, there's a whole lot more if you're willing to drive into the city. We tried out one or two, and then at a certain point, St. Patrick came on our radar. And this was, I think especially for my wife was, this was a real, whoa, there's this Western rite within Orthodoxy, and she loved our Orthodox parish. We were going to, thought the liturgy was beautiful in the Eastern tradition, but there was definitely a part of her that, really loved the Western tradition in particular, the music, and she's a musician, the Western musical tradition and chant and polyphony and organs and things of that nature, all very near and dear to her, and so. She was like, wow, there's a possibility, we can be Orthodox and I could still have these beautiful and good things from the Western tradition. And so I was like, yeah, well, it's a little bit far, but let's check it out. Well, maybe we'll visit once in a while. And so Epiphany 2019, we came and we knew pretty quick. We were like, oh, actually, yeah, this is it. This is the this is the parish. This is, I think, where we're supposed to land. And so have been there ever since. We were chrismated that Pascha, April 2019. With our two oldest and at the time, and have been very happily Orthodox ever since.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful. And so you've been at St. Patrick's now for about 7 years?
Yeah, 6 years, 6.5 years or so.
How are you involved currently?
Yeah. Well, yeah, we're both of us are pretty involved. As I mentioned, Hannah's a musician, really brilliant musician. She's joined the St. Patrick's choir, and they're also kind of well known. They get, people, if they've heard of our church, it's usually either just association with the Western Rite or they've heard our choir before. Some good albums, check them out. Spotify, YouTube, And so she got involved in the choir there, which was honestly, it was also just a beautiful experience for me because it meant that I was down in the pew with our kids. And as some more kids came along, it meant that during the liturgy, during the Mass, I got to spend a lot of time with them, wrangling them and stuff too, but also, something that I hadn't really anticipated, but was really such a beautiful experience as an Orthodox parent is receiving communion with your children, right? And not just the 7-year-olds and up, but all of your children. When our third was born, and baptized at St. Patrick, and she's chrismated and she received communion, and then I'm bringing her up every Sunday, and to receive communion with her. I mean, that was just oh my goodness, one of the great highlights of being a parent. Period. To be able to do that.
So what advice would you give quickly? I know this can be a very long answer, but what kind of advice would you give to people who they might be Catholics interested in Orthodoxy? Or it even could be Protestants or spiritual seekers who might even be kind of exploring both. What would just be maybe a little bit of advice that you might give them, since that's been part of your journey?
I think three things pop to mind. One is read Orthodox spiritual literature. And I think especially some of the modern saints and elders, monastic writers, not because they're, better than like the fathers or anything, but just because I think because they're writing in a modern era and they're writing in a modern style, sort of, there's something that's can be very relatable about them. Especially personal favorite, Saint Porphyrios, was a Greek monk and saint who reposed back in 1991, so relatively recent. He has a great collection of writings. It's his life and his spiritual counsels called Wounded by Love. It's a great collection. Highly recommend that one. And then also Elder Thaddeus, his book Our Thoughts Determine Our Lives is another fantastic read. Very, very eye-opening and a transformative book. But really, apart from, what do I want to say? Reading that kind of spiritual literature is going to give you a much better idea of the flavor of orthodoxy, of sort of the atmosphere of what orthodoxy is like, right? Closer to a firsthand experience. Not so much, the theological debates or academic papers on, did Rome accept the canons from this, particular local council, and here's the scholarly debate. And, that's fine to have those discussions, but that's not going to help you in your journey. I think, what you want to start with is, I would say, get some more firsthand exposure to how orthodoxy works, really, and from those who knew it best, really, the masters of what it means to be a Christian, really. So that's the first thing. The second thing is visit an Orthodox church. If you are close to an Orthodox church or close enough to an Orthodox church, there isn't a substitute for experiencing it firsthand. So go there, experience the liturgy. Meet the people, and don't just do it once. If you can do it again and again. To a real community, real people, a real particular church, and experience orthodoxy from the inside. That is going to be way more useful than getting caught up in academic debates about theology. And is going to give you a much better idea of what orthodoxy is like on the ground. And I think it's going to put you in a place where you can ask the questions you need to ask, right? And explore the things you need to explore. And then the third thing, and I say this from my own experience, this is my own experience as a Catholic first exploring orthodoxy, is I was very personally attached to the papacy, right? And it wasn't even necessarily the theology of it or anything like that. I just couldn't imagine life as a Christian where I wasn't connected back to the Pope and to Rome and to St. Peter's and everything that goes with that. And I've had conversations with lots of Catholics who we talk about all this stuff, and at the end of the day, they say actually that they agree with me. They agree with everything I'm saying. Yes, it all totally makes sense. They want this traditional liturgy. They want this sort of balanced theology. They want all of it. But they get to the end and they say, but I just can't leave Rome. I just can't leave the Pope, That's just part of who I am. And so I guess my advice there is just, it's okay. It's going to be okay. If you are seriously exploring orthodoxy, don't worry about that too much. Again, visit a parish, learn about what orthodoxy is like as a way of life from the inside, and then you'll be in a better position to address that question. I think it can be something that can feel very disorienting for people. It felt very disorienting for me to feel like if I didn't have the Pope, if I didn't have this, rock, right, to lean on, to stand on, was I just going to be plunged into, the chaotic waters of, I wouldn't know what's true. I wouldn't know what to believe, right? I wouldn't know where to turn. And the reality is that's not what happens. It's not orthodoxy at all. It's not chaotic. There's actually a profound sense of identity and security and clarity, and clarity of, belief and clarity of purpose that comes with that. I was saying earlier how Pope Benedict was looking for a way to reform Catholicism, to bring it back to what it was supposed to be, to, in continuity with the tradition, but really to get back to this core of what the church was supposed to be, liturgically, theologically. It hit me one day that what he was looking for was orthodoxy, right? He was looking for that church that had never lost the spirit of the liturgy, that had never lost its vital connection, its living connection to the fathers of the church, that had never lost its deep connection to, Scripture as a way to shape its theology. That he had wanted to, go back to the sources and draw from them. And it hit me, it's all right there. You don't have to reconstruct it. You don't have to tie yourself up in knots trying to explain how do you make, this sort of, these Tridentine dogmatic pronouncements all consistent with whatever. You don't have to twist yourself in knots like that. It actually was always just there. Similarly, when he famously talked about the future church as the one that's smaller, poorer, doesn't have as much worldly clout, but one which is faithful and one which is on fire and one which, consists of these Christians who are living the faith in its fullness. That's orthodoxy too, right? That's what he was talking about. He didn't know it at the time, but that's what he was looking for. So I really believe that far from, becoming disoriented, far from now feeling unmoored, what orthodoxy actually gives you is everything you're looking for as a Catholic. So my advice, I guess, is don't worry about that. Go and experience, come and see, and it's going to be okay.
Well, Dr. Brian Donohue, great to have you on the show, and look forward to having you on again. For those who are paid subscribers, I think we're going to do a little hangout part 2. So hang on and join the fun conversation. We'll be diving into some of these topics a little bit deeper. It'll be fun.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks, Kyle.
Thank you again. Take care. You were touching a little bit on the papacy in part 1, and I think, of course, it's a big question for people who are like, either thinking about becoming Orthodox or Catholic, or you're Catholic thinking about becoming Orthodox. So, like, what were some specific ways you approached this question when you were considering, like, I want to be Orthodox, but am I even allowed to?
Yeah.
And you talked about in the part 1, kind of like, of course, the disorienting aspect of that.
Yeah.
But what was it that allowed you enough sort of peace to get past maybe some of those theological barriers?
I think one place to start would be